Right, everybody, I'm going to talk you through your mock exam and just move forward in the video to whichever bit that you feel that you need to tackle first. Look at where you've lost the most marks. For this narrative question, you get the narrative question, you get the dates, they're very important, and then you get some things that you could write about. I'll be honest, the first lesson you could learn here is I don't even really look at those. Because they can make, like you might have talked about the introduction of barbed wire, but you might have had better things to write about. And we've got 3 targets that you may have been given here. The first one, ensure I explain the topic in chronological order. Well, I can't really show you that, you just have to make sure you've done that. And you'll get an idea from my answer in a minute. Ensure you use connectives to link the events of the narrative together. Well, I can show you that. So here we go. Now, in the first paragraph, actually there's not much linking going on. Like any story, it's like setting the scene. So there's not really this led to, this led to. But as soon as I get into the middle of my story, this led to this, which led to this, which as a result of this led to this. And then in the last paragraph as well, you can see there's lots of things of me saying how one thing led to another. And if you're thinking, if you've got that target, these are little phrases that you could steal. And finally, there needs to be a beginning, middle, and an end. Well, the easiest way to do that is start with in the beginning of the narrative and end with at the end of the narrative, and put it in like this. You know, you can see a beginning, middle, and an end. The examiner can't tell you that you don't have that. So pause if you need to, have a look at this example and use it to help you do some green pen. On to the second question, which is explain why the Montgomery bus boycott succeeded in achieving its aims. We've done loads of questions like this. And you can see all the different targets down here, and I've tried to colour code things in my example answer. I've only done 2 paragraphs. You should try to do 3 if you had time at the end to come back, but the bits in colour are the red, which suggests that I am focusing on the question. It's so important. It's every year the examiners say the most marks were lost on this paper by students not focusing on the question. You're not being asked, tell us about the Montgomery bus boycott. You're being asked, explain why it was successful. So you have to use succeeded in your answer, and rule in favour counts as succeeded because that is a success in itself. The blue bit is specific evidence. So I've shown that I knew this fact, I knew about the outcome of Brown versus Topeka, I had the date in there, what the ruling was in Brown versus Topeka, the fact that it set a precedent. This is me proving that I've got my own knowledge that can help me stand out. And key terms can come under that as well. Paragraphs, you might need to go into a bit more detail, that sort of thing. And you can see at the start of the paragraph how I've said the main reason and then another reason. So that's a short version. If I had enough time in an exam, I would have done 3, but to fit on this screen, I've just done 2 paragraphs. Now, we've done quite a lot of work on how useful questions, and this one's how useful are they for an inquiry into the effects of the Tet Offensive. And again, you probably should be using the word effect in your answer quite a lot here. And instead of writing an answer, I've got the sources here, and I'm going to talk you through my thought process of how I would tackle this. And remember, you've got to do knowledge, and you've got to do provenance. Provenance and own knowledge to assess these sources for the effects of the Tet Offensive on American attempts to win the Vietnam War. Now, what we've got here is a newspaper article written by a British journalist living long after the war, and he's living and working in Saigon during the Tet Offensive, so he experienced it, and he's writing in retrospect, and he's looking back. He says, my friend called to tell me there was heavy fighting in the streets. I joined him as quickly as I could. The local police looked terrified. I followed a patrol of soldiers to the president's palace where a furious street battle was happening. For several hours we were trapped by gunfire with the dead body of an American soldier next to us. Later that day we began to learn the scale of the communist Tet Offensive. 4,000 fighters had entered Saigon, attacking dozens of targets, including the American embassy. Almost every other town and major US base in South Vietnam had also been attacked. Now, that paints a picture of the carnage that the Viet Cong caused when they came out of hiding and abandoned their guerrilla warfare tactics to mount a large-scale offensive, the Tet Offensive. And if we're looking about what does it tell us about the effects of the Tet Offensive on American attempts to win the war? Well, I would argue it paints a picture that Americans were really struggling to stop the Tet Offensive. It mentions a dead body, it mentions how many were involved in it, it mentions that the journalist was trapped by gunfire. It makes it seem like the American military was struggling. And if I check that against my own knowledge, I know, and you should know, that militarily, the Americans absolutely whooped the Viet Cong. In military terms, as soon as the Viet Cong came out of hiding, well, this sort of thing was happening. The Americans had just overwhelming firepower and an incredibly strong army. And yes, the Viet Cong did cause carnage for a while, but ultimately they were absolutely decimated by the American army. So look at the provenance to make me think, how did it come to this? Well, first of all, he seems to be talking about the first day, and largely, and that's telling, because the Tet Offensive wasn't just one day, the Tet Offensive was over several days. And yes, there probably was a lot of surprise and carnage on the first day when it was a big surprise, and I know from my knowledge it was a big surprise. But provenance, you're looking at, he did experience it himself, and he's a journalist, not a soldier. Perhaps he was traumatized by what he saw. It sounds quite a traumatic event, and maybe he himself has been affected by what happened to the extent that he makes it sound like the Viet Cong caused more carnage than maybe a soldier would have reported, because they were used to this sort of thing. And finally, it's a newspaper article, and newspapers are designed to sell. So perhaps he's over-exaggerating what the Tet Offensive was like, and in doing so, he makes it seem like it had a big effect on the American attempts to win the Vietnam War. A big negative effect, I would say. So you look at the provenance, you look at the knowledge, you make sure you focus on effects of the Tet Offensive on American attempts to win the war. This one shows US troops removing the last Viet Cong soldier from the grounds of the American embassy. With his tatty clothes, he looks in big trouble. He looks surrounded by American soldiers with their guns. They look victorious, they look strong. He looks beaten, and that tallies with my own knowledge of the Tet Offensive, that it was a huge military victory for the United States. Of course, it was a huge strategic or propaganda victory for the Viet Cong back in America, because it led to Americans starting to question if this war could actually be won, and if they were really winning as the politicians had told them. But we don't see any of that here. It's just about the Americans' ability to win the war, and it's just focusing on military issues. And that suggests the Americans were struggling, and that suggests the Americans dealt with the situation, and this is the one which tallies the most with my own knowledge. However, you still have to look at the provenance. This is talking about at the end of the moving from the embassy. This is talking about the start of the offensive. So they're looking at two different aspects, and it's only one photograph. It's been chosen because it's dramatic, probably because it's the removal of the last soldier. What you maybe don't see is the carnage that this Viet Cong fighter and all his comrades managed to cause in attacking the American embassy. And we know they did cause a lot. From our own knowledge, it was one of the most famous events in the whole of the Vietnam War when the Viet Cong attacked the American embassy. So you look at your own knowledge, you look at the provenance and the type of source, and you can see it shows us that the Viet Cong didn't really have a massive effect on the American military's ability to win the war. Now then, interpretation 1 and 2 focuses on this side, as we see from this question. It says they give different views about the effects of the Tet Offensive on American attempts to win the war. So it's the same thing as the how useful question. What is the difference? Now this one says it was a complete military disaster, which we know is true. It was a great victory in terms of military and tactics because of all of the Viet Cong that were killed. Interpretation 2, though, focuses more on how the Tet Offensive caused a reaction back in America and how the American public turned against the war. So it was a bit of a strategic victory for the Viet Cong because it caused the American public to step up their campaign and gain more support to try to force the politicians to end the war in Vietnam. So if you think the difference, what is the main difference? Well, this one's saying that the Viet Cong was a victory for the Americans in military terms, and this one's saying that the Tet Offensive was a bit of a defeat for America because of the reaction it had back home. Now, this is the most stupid question in all of the exam. It's just a reason why they give different views. I gave you this advice if you paid attention to it, if you're in my class. You basically need to memorize this answer and insert, I'll colour it in for you. These two bits you need to replace with whatever the question is, or whatever the interpretations are actually about. Other than that, the black area you can use every time. It's the most ludicrous exam question, and if you did something like this, it's 4 out of 4. And finally, in my epic video, we come to the interpretations and the sort of things that you need to do. So the first thing I want to highlight that's so important, you need to have used both interpretations. It does ask you how far do you agree with interpretation 2, but it's really important that you also use interpretation 1. Second thing, you have to focus on the question. It doesn't say how much do you agree with interpretation 2 generally. It says how much do you agree with the parts of interpretation 2 that help you to assess the effects of the Tet Offensive on the American attempts to win the Vietnam War. So those two things that I'm going to pick out. Now I haven't done an example answer for you here. I'm going to go around the class and show people some great example answers that I have seen and what makes them great answers. For now, for the sake of this video, the way that you would set this out, so my introduction would say how much I agree with interpretation 2. So I agreed with interpretation 2 to a large extent, or to an extent at least. I would write something like that. Then I would have my paragraph on all the reasons why this might be true. And I'd be talking about student protests, how 1968 was a turning point where the media started to turn against the Vietnam War and the public protests grew larger, and it was also the year that Johnson himself decided he was not going to stand for re-election. It was a huge transformative year. All of that knowledge would help me to pick out quotes that say that, yeah, that's fairly accurate, and that's my red. Things I've just talked about would be my additional specific supporting knowledge. Then you'd have to have a paragraph challenging the interpretation and saying why somebody might argue that that's a bit over the top. And you could talk about the hard hats and how polls still suggested that people supported the war in Vietnam more than they were against it. And in that paragraph where you're questioning interpretation 2, you would also bring in interpretation 1. So to recap this question so far, I would do a short introduction, a paragraph all about why I would support the interpretation, using specific evidence, a paragraph why I might question this or why this might be a better interpretation, again using specific evidence, and then you've got to end with a conclusion that says just to what extent you agree with this and especially why. Pick out a key bit of evidence to support why you agree with this to whatever extent you do, or why you disagree with it to whatever extent you do. And there you have it, my guide to how to tackle your mock exam green pen work. I hope this was useful, but do put your hand up, and whichever teacher you've got, they'll come across and help you out.